What if the coming days could mark one of the most important diplomatic moments in the modern history of the Horn of Africa? For decades, Somaliland has operated as a self-governing territory, maintaining its own institutions, conducting elections, and building stability in a region often challenged by conflict and political uncertainty. Yet despite these achievements, Somaliland remains largely unrecognized on the international stage. Now, as June 26th and July 1st approach, speculation is growing. Diplomatic meetings are taking place. Regional alliances are shifting. Global powers are paying closer attention to the strategic waters of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Could this period become a historic turning point? Could one or more countries take steps that move Somaliland closer to international recognition? And if recognition does come, how could it reshape politics, economics, and security across East Africa? In today's special report, we examine the facts, separate reality from rumors, and explore what could happen next. We'll begin by looking at Somaliland's long journey toward recognition. Then we'll explore why the period between June 26th and July 1st is attracting international attention. After that, we'll analyze which countries are most frequently mentioned in diplomatic discussions. And finally, we'll examine what recognition could mean for Somaliland, Somalia, and the wider region. Welcome to Horn Vision. Let's begin. Somaliland's long road to recognition. To understand why the coming days are generating so much discussion, we first need to understand Somaliland's unique historical journey. The story begins in 1960. On June 26, 1960, the former British Somaliland Protectorate gained independence from the United Kingdom. For a brief period, Somaliland existed as an independent state. More than 30 countries reportedly recognized the newly independent territory during those historic days. Excitement and optimism filled the air. Many people across the Somali territories dreamed of creating a united Somali nation. Just a few days later, on July 1, 1960, British Somaliland voluntarily united with the Trust Territory of Somalia, which had gained independence from Italian administration. Together, they formed the Somali Republic. At the time, the union was celebrated by many as a step toward greater unity and shared national identity. However, over the years, political tensions began to emerge. Many people in the north increasingly felt that power and resources were becoming concentrated elsewhere. Disagreements over governance, representation, and development grew stronger. As political instability expanded during the following decades, trust between different parts of the country weakened. By the 1980s, tensions had intensified dramatically. Conflict spread across several regions. The government faced growing opposition movements. Many communities experienced hardship and displacement. The situation reached a breaking point as violence escalated. Then came 1991. After the collapse of the Somali central government, leaders from Somaliland gathered to discuss the future. At a conference held in Bureau, they made a historic decision. They declared the restoration of Somaliland's sovereignty, arguing that the voluntary union of 1960 had failed and that Somaliland was returning to the independent status it briefly held before the union. Since that moment, Somaliland has followed a very different path from southern Somalia. While many parts of the region struggled with instability, Somaliland focused on building local institutions. Traditional leaders, community representatives, and political actors worked together to create governance structures. Over time, Somaliland established its own presidency, parliament, judiciary, police forces, and administrative systems. Perhaps most significantly, Somaliland invested heavily in security and stability. Local communities played an important role in maintaining peace. Negotiations and reconciliation efforts helped reduce internal tensions. This approach attracted attention from observers who noted the contrast between Somaliland and many neighboring conflict zones. But governance alone would not be enough. To strengthen its case internationally, Somaliland also pursued democratic reforms. Over the years, multiple elections were organized: presidential elections, parliamentary elections, local council elections. Political parties competed for power through ballots rather than violence. International observers often highlighted these developments as evidence of institutional maturity. Supporters of recognition argue that Somaliland has demonstrated many of the characteristics typically associated with statehood. It maintains defined territory. It has a permanent
Why June 26, July 1 matters as we move forward in this story, a crucial question emerges. Why are so many people paying attention to the period between June 26 and July 1? After all, dates on a calendar come and go every year. What makes this particular week different? To answer that question, we must begin with history. June 26 occupies a special place in Somaliland's national memory. It was on June 26, 1960, that the former British Somaliland Protectorate gained independence. For Somaliland supporters, this date represents more than a historical event. It symbolizes a moment when Somaliland briefly existed as an independent state before voluntarily entering the union that created the Somali Republic. Every year, celebrations, ceremonies, and public events mark this anniversary. Political leaders deliver speeches. Citizens reflect on their history. International observers watch developments closely. But this year, many analysts believe the significance extends beyond historical remembrance. The regional environment is changing. Global priorities are changing, and diplomatic conversations appear to be accelerating. Just days after June 26 comes another important date, July 1. This date marks the formation of the Somali Republic in 1960 through the union of British Somaliland and Italian Somalia. For decades, these two anniversaries have represented different interpretations of history and statehood. As a result, the period between June 26 and July 1 often attracts heightened political attention. Statements made during this time are carefully analyzed. Diplomatic signals are scrutinized. Even small developments can generate significant speculation. And this year is no exception. Over recent months, diplomatic activity across the Horn of Africa has intensified. Government officials from various countries have engaged in discussions involving trade, security, infrastructure, and regional cooperation. International delegations continue visiting key locations throughout the region. Strategic partnerships are being reviewed. Economic opportunities are expanding. At the same time, competition among global powers is increasing. Why? Because the Horn of Africa sits at one of the world's most important crossroads. To understand this reality, look at a map. The Red Sea connects Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. The Gulf of Aden serves as a gateway to some of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. A significant portion of global trade passes through these waters. Energy supplies, consumer goods, industrial materials, everything from food shipments to fuel deliveries moves through nearby maritime routes. Any country located near these strategic waterways naturally attracts international attention. And Somaliland occupies a highly significant position along this corridor. This geographic reality has become increasingly important in recent years. Around the world, governments are reassessing supply chains. Military planners are reviewing security strategies. Businesses are searching for reliable trade routes. Investors are looking for stable locations near major transportation networks. As a result, the strategic value of ports and coastal infrastructure has risen dramatically. This brings us to Berbera. Over the last several years, Berbera Port has attracted growing interest from regional and international stakeholders. Infrastructure projects have expanded capacity. Transportation links have improved. New economic opportunities have emerged. Supporters argue that Berbera's development could transform regional trade patterns. And where economic interests grow, diplomatic interest often follows. This is one reason analysts are paying close attention to developments during this period. Another factor involves broader geopolitical shifts. Across the world, alliances are evolving. Countries are adapting to new security challenges. Economic competition is reshaping international relationships. The Horn of Africa is increasingly becoming part of these larger strategic calculations. Regional governments are pursuing new partnerships. Foreign powers are expanding engagement. International organizations are increasing their involvement. Against this backdrop, every diplomatic meeting can take on added significance. A routine visit may suddenly attract headlines. A policy statement may generate speculation. A symbolic gesture may be interpreted in multiple ways. This creates an environment where rumors can spread rapidly. And that is exactly what has happened in recent weeks. Social media platforms have been filled with claims, predictions, and speculation regarding possible recognition announcements. Some posts suggest major diplomatic breakthroughs are imminent. Others claim secret negotiations are underway. Some predict specific countries are preparing dramatic policy shifts. But separating fact from speculation is essential. The reality is that recognition decisions are among the most significant actions governments can take. Such decisions usually involve extensive legal reviews, diplomatic consultations, strategic assessments, and careful consideration of regional consequences. They are rarely made overnight. This does not mean developments are impossible. It simply means that observers should approach rumors with caution. The most reliable indicators often come from official statements, diplomatic engagements, government policies, and verifiable actions. Experienced analysts therefore focus on facts rather than speculation. They examine trends. They study strategic interests. They monitor official contacts. And they look for concrete evidence of changing relationships. What makes this particular period fascinating is that several important trends are converging at the same time. Growing interest in Red Sea security, increasing competition among international powers, expanding economic opportunities, strengthening regional partnerships, and renewed discussions surrounding Somaliland's international status. Individually, each trend would attract attention. Together, they create a moment that many observers consider unusually significant. Yet there remains an important question. Are we witnessing the early stages of a major diplomatic shift? Or are expectations running ahead of reality? At this stage, nobody can answer with certainty. What we do know is that governments across the region and beyond are paying close attention. Diplomatic calculations are underway. Strategic interests are being reassessed, and the decisions made in the coming months could have consequences extending far beyond Somaliland itself. That is why analysts are watching June 26 through July 1 so closely. Not because recognition is guaranteed, not because a dramatic announcement is inevitable, but because this period highlights broader changes occurring throughout the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea region. Changes that could shape the future for years to come. And that leads us to the next major question. If recognition were ever to happen, which countries might be most likely to move first? Which governments have the strongest strategic incentives? Which face the greatest risks? And what obstacles remain standing in the way? Which countries could move first? Now we arrive at the question generating the most discussion. If Somaliland were to receive recognition or a major diplomatic breakthrough, which countries might move first? This is where speculation often becomes intense. Social media is filled with predictions. Political commentators debate possible scenarios. Supporters and critics offer competing arguments. But rather than focusing on rumors, let's examine the strategic realities that influence government decisions. The first thing to understand is that recognition is never simply about diplomacy. It is also about economics, security, trade, regional influence, and long-term national interests. Every government considering such a decision would ask the same question. What advantages and risks would recognition create? That is why analysts often focus on countries with significant interests in the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea region. Let's begin with neighboring countries. For nations located near Somaliland, geography matters. Regional stability affects trade. Security developments influence border management. Maritime access impacts economic growth. Because of this, neighboring governments carefully monitor developments involving Somaliland. Among the countries most frequently discussed is Ethiopia. Why? Because Ethiopia is Africa's second most populous nation and one of the continent's fastest-growing economies. Despite its size, Ethiopia is landlocked. This means access to ports remains a strategic priority. For decades, Ethiopian imports and exports have relied heavily on regional maritime infrastructure. As trade volumes grow, the importance of diversified access routes increases. This reality has made developments along the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden particularly significant. Observers often note that economic connectivity projects, transportation corridors, and port partnerships could shape future regional relationships. Supporters of closer engagement argue that greater cooperation could create mutual economic benefits. Critics warn that sensitive political issues must be managed carefully. As a result, Ethiopia remains one of the most closely watched countries whenever discussions about Somaliland's international status emerge. But Ethiopia is not the only country attracting attention. Across the Gulf of Aden lies another group of influential actors. The Gulf states have invested heavily in maritime infrastructure, logistics networks, and regional trade routes. For these countries, stability along shipping corridors is essential. Energy exports, commercial transportation, international commerce, all depend on secure maritime access. As a result, several Gulf nations have developed economic partnerships throughout the Horn of Africa. Ports, airports, infrastructure projects, investment agreements. These activities have expanded significantly over the past decade. Analysts therefore pay close attention to diplomatic signals coming from the Gulf region. Not necessarily because recognition is imminent, but because economic and strategic engagement continues to grow. Then there are the major global powers. Countries such as the United States, China, the United Kingdom, and others maintain substantial interests in the region. Why? Because the Red Sea has become one of the world's most strategically important waterways. Military planners view it as a critical security corridor. Businesses view it as a major trade artery. Governments view it as an area where geopolitical influence matters. Any development affecting this region naturally attracts international attention. However, global powers often face complex calculations. On one hand, they may value stability, economic opportunity, and security cooperation. On the other hand, they must consider international law, regional diplomacy, and relationships with existing governments. These competing priorities can make policy decisions extremely complicated. This explains why recognition questions often move slowly. Governments are not simply evaluating Somaliland itself. They are also evaluating broader regional consequences. Would recognition strengthen stability? Could it create new diplomatic tensions? How would neighboring states react? What precedent might it establish? These questions require careful analysis. Economic considerations are equally important. Supporters of recognition frequently argue that formal international status could unlock new opportunities. Foreign investment could increase. Financial institutions could expand engagement. Trade agreements could become easier to negotiate. Infrastructure projects could attract additional funding. Businesses generally prefer predictable legal environments. Recognition, supporters argue, could improve certainty for investors. Yet governments must also consider potential risks. Recognition could trigger political disagreements. Diplomatic disputes could emerge. Regional organizations might face internal divisions. As a result, policymakers often weigh potential benefits against possible complications. Security concerns also play a major role. The Horn of Africa sits near regions affected by piracy, terrorism, smuggling, and geopolitical competition. Governments therefore evaluate how any diplomatic decision could influence security cooperation. Would recognition improve coordination? Would it create new challenges? Different analysts offer different answers. This uncertainty contributes to the cautious approach many governments adopt. Another important obstacle involves international institutions. Recognition is not merely a bilateral issue. Regional organizations and multilateral forums also matter. Governments often prefer coordinated approaches rather than acting completely alone. This means even countries that may be sympathetic to Somaliland's arguments could choose to move carefully. Timing becomes crucial. Diplomatic consensus can take years to develop. Political leadership changes can alter priorities. Regional crises can shift attention elsewhere. As a result, predictions often prove unreliable. History demonstrates this repeatedly. Numerous moments over the past 3 decades have generated excitement. Announcements seemed possible. Speculation intensified. Expectations rose, yet formal recognition did not materialize. This historical experience explains why many experts remain cautious today. They acknowledge that geopolitical conditions are evolving. They recognize